plaisir d'être avec vous ce soir. Je ne vais peut-être pas parler de contact tracing, mais je vais vous parler d'un jeu qui émerge de ma recherche en intelligence artificielle et qui touche plutôt la société dans son ensemble. I'm going to share my screen, if you allow me, here. All right. So, AI, social impact, and public goods. Let's see. Well, AI has made amazing progress in the last couple of decades, and it's been a pleasure to be part of this adventure. The progress has been in great part in perception, but also manipulating language, playing games, and is now at the heart of a huge industry. And some of the largest, richest companies in the world are now really basing their business on this technology. At the same time, we are still very far from human-level AI. Another time I might tell you about my basic research in AI, where we're trying to take inspiration from humans to bridge that gap. It still is very significant. But while we're doing this, those tools are being deployed in society. And it's really important that we understand they're not magic. They're tools. And one issue is they're powerful, and they will become even more powerful in the future. Why is that a problem? Well, they can be used for positive social value, but they can also be misused. In particular, one of my concerns is powerful tools can be used to increase one's wealth or power. Think about, having a very powerful weapon. How, you could use that to increase the power you already have. And concentration of power is, in a way, in direct contradiction with our democratic values. Because what is democracy? Democracy is about sharing power. And so I've been thinking about, in the last few months, why is it that these kinds of powerful tools are sometimes being misused? Why is it that some organizations, in particular corporations, in trying to maximize the incentives that are in front of them, are acting in a way that's hurting potentially public good? So, I mean, at the end of the day, it's in a way not their fault. It's the role of society, it's the role of government to set the rules of the game so that those powerful tools be used and governed by collective needs, whether in each country or internationally. So, one thing I'm concerned with is what I would like to call the wisdom race, that whether it's in biotechnology or it's in AI or in other areas, we're building more and more powerful tools, but our collective wisdom isn't catching up fast enough. And that's, in a way, endangering all of us. So I think there's been progress in our collective wisdom. It's just not fast enough. So let's see, what can be done. One step in that direction that I'm very happy about, but is clearly not enough, is the Montreal Declaration, which was something we worked on a couple of years ago, that led to a set of ethical principles for the deployment of AI. And under each of these principles, like the well-being principle, or the solidarity principle, or the sustainable development principle, there's a number of sub recommendations and principles. And these ethical declarations are one step towards trying to govern these powerful tools more responsibly in society. The next step is in more of the governance side, like in practice, how do we turn these ethical principles into policies. And of course, then the last step is to actually deploy these policies. Now, I'm not an expert in policy, but because of being part of those discussions, I've started to ask myself questions, and I've realized that some of those questions are interestingly connected to some of the questions we are asking in AI about how to make sure that an AI system is going to be aligned with human values and public good. In fact, that is a question that is very closely related to the question of how do we make sure that corporations will behave in a way that is aligned with human values and public good. A lot of the same questions arise, and of course there are also differences. And the reason this is bothersome is that our current rules of the game in Western countries and in general on this planet have led to a set of laws and regulations that attempt to steer corporations in a good direction and making sure that they don't hurt public good and people and those ethical principles. But it's not working. Companies are, not all of them, but there's a lot of harm that is coming out of their behavior, whether it's environmental harm with pollution, climate change, effects on biodiversity, social harm, exploiting populations in poor countries, the problems with social media, discrimination, political harm, as we're seeing in elections in some of our neighboring countries. Medical harm. This is something I've been very much involved recently because of COVID-19. There are market failures that lead to companies either doing something that's hurtful or not doing something that they should be doing for the public good, but is not profitable. So, yeah, how do we fix this? Let me go back and tell you about this little figure on top right here. This is a bit of an abstraction to talk about public good versus self-interest. So the letter pi here means a policy. It's how an individual, an agent, or a company behaves. And how it changes its behavior is represented by these arrows. So individually, we have a drive to move in some direction, to do things that are in agreement with our wishes, our impulses, or values. And similarly, companies are moving in some direction, and mostly this is driven by trying to maximize profit under the constraint of remaining legal, usually. And that direction of change, of moving, may not be aligned with the direction that would correspond to maximizing public good, ethical principles, and so on. So let's think about these two directions and the kind of angle they make. And essentially, if you think geometrically about these questions, you realize that if the angle between these directions is less than 90 degrees, then it's okay. Like, the company may not be doing exactly what's best for society, but it's still helping in some ways. But it could also form an angle greater than 90 degrees. And in that case, the more it changes, the more it hurts society. And that is happening. And so how do governments react to that? Well, they create laws that put constraints. You're allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that. So that's the first means for governments to try to prevent this. And what I will claim is that what happens to corporations after they mature is that their behavior changes until they hit the boundaries of those constraints. They do what is barely legal that maximizes their profit, and then they're like they're trying to continue maximizing profit, but staying legal. So they're always like on the border of being legal. That is the natural thing for them to do. It's not that those people are bad. It's just that, if you want to maximize profit and stay legal, this is the optimal thing to do. And of course, that's not good, because near that border, the laws are not perfect, and so you might actually do things that are not morally right, even though you're just on the border of being legal. There are also interesting geometrical questions that I've been thinking about that have to do with the limitations of constraints as a way to steer companies in better directions. And the problem is, in a very high dimensional space of all the things that a corporation could do, it's almost impossible to properly constrain their behavior with all the right constraints. You might need an exponentially large number of constraints. And the consequence of that is that there's usually a way for a corporation to find loopholes. In other words, satisfy the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. So how do we get around that? Well, governments also have a second tool that they're using. And that is not, you're allowed to do this or you're not allowed to do that. These are hard constraints. They also have the ability to create incentives. So an incentive is like another direction in the space of change, which we're trying to steer companies towards. And ideally, you can show that the right direction is towards public good. And companies can do that by fines, taxes, grants. It could be positive, it could be negative. So fiscal policy is the main tool here. And what is interesting is that from the point of view of geometry, of understanding companies as agents that try to do their best in terms of maximizing profit under those incentives and under those constraints, fiscal policy is actually a much more powerful tool than hard constraints. Okay, so that's one element that connects with my knowledge as a scientist in computer scientist and AI scientist. Another aspect of how to create those incentives that come out of that work is incentives shouldn't be all or none. They should be gradual. So if a company is polluting, every little bit of less pollution that the company is throwing away should be rewarded. For example, cap and trade markets for carbon are not very good in that respect, because until the company hits the cap, there is no incentive to actually improve their behavior. So you want the incentive system to be smooth, that a small change in the behavior of the company is going to lead to a small reward for the company or a small penalty, so that there's always pressure to push them in the right direction, just like any learning agents of the kind we have in AI. Now, one problem with incentives, which is very, very fundamental, is how do we define them? Like, how do we quantify the contribution to public good or the harm to public good that an organization generates? And unfortunately, there are no easy, simple answer to this. That's where the devil is in the detail. But the good news is that a lot of scholars, a lot of scientists, a lot of people in politics have been thinking about these questions. And for example, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the UN define a set of public goods that matter planet-wide. And they've defined 231 indicators, things you can monitor, things you can quantify, that potentially could serve as metrics for these kinds of incentives. So what we would need in principle is to change the way that corporations are reporting to governments. Instead of only reporting about the financial flows as we normally do in normal accounting, they should be reporting about more generally all of their activities in any of the ways that they can either help or hurt public good. That means companies, any kind of organization should be much more transparent than they are today if we want this kind of thing to happen. Now, there's another issue with an incentive-based system to steer organizations towards better behavior, and that is the problem that a lot of the public goods we care about are happening in the future. Maybe a company creates a chemical today, and we only discover 10 years from now, 20 years from now, that it creates diseases, cancer or something. But the company might already kind of know that, because they haven't tested that chemical, there is a danger that it could happen. Right now, they have no incentive to deal with that. In fact, they have an incentive to not do any study that could potentially show that this is dangerous. So there's a problem, which is that a lot of the public goods we care about are in the future, and we would like to steer the behavior of companies today. So how can we do that? Well, there's already a mechanism in our society that does something like this. It's stock markets, right? If you think about it, what is a stock price? As estimated by the market agents, it's the sum of all the dividends that one expects to get in the future, discounted by some sort of interest rate that basically says we prefer dividends tomorrow than next year. So in a way, the traders, the bankers, and people who are trading, investors, they are already estimating something in the future and converting it into a price today that drives the behavior of corporations. The only problem is the future impact that they're looking at is purely profit. What we would like is for markets to estimate the future contribution to public good of a corporation. And I think we could do that. So is that a crazy idea? No, in fact, we already have some markets for public goods, in particular in Quebec and in California, and until recently Ontario. We had we still have a market for rights to emit carbon in the atmosphere. Now, as I said earlier, it's a cap and trade market, which doesn't quite provide the right sort of incentive, but it's already a step in the right direction. So in principle, we could have markets for many other public goods. But of course, for these markets to exist, governments must step in to define some rules of the game, to say like how much they think that a ton of carbon should cost if you're going to emit a ton of carbon. So I think we should do a lot more of that. And I'm thinking in particular that governments could charge for what they estimate, and what the markets estimate will be what future governments will charge for, say, the ton of carbon. So what I mean is this: right now, say the ton of carbon in Quebec and California is peanuts. It's like $20 or something. It's almost sure for any rational person, so it's not about political opinion, that it will be higher in the future. And so instead of charging $20 for a ton of carbon today, what governments could say is, well, we're going to charge you what we think future governments will charge for this. And if our estimate is wrong, we'll correct it. So if maybe we underestimate, we'll charge you more. If we overestimate, we'll give you back money. And it doesn't have to be a charge. It could be a tax credit. There are many ways it could be done. But the idea is that governments, by committing to saying each year, this is how much we think a ton of carbon in the past few years should have been taxed, and then charged for the difference, can create a market for public goods. And they could do that not just for carbon, they could do that for any other good. And so this idea of governments intervening in the reward system of companies is actually something that many people are starting to think about. In Canada, we already have programs that are going in that direction with what's called social finance. but I think we're, just at the beginning of something that could be much more powerful in our ability to steer organizations towards better behavior, and also to fund nonprofits, for example, who want to do something that's good for society, but for which it's hard to get capital right now because there's no market for that. If governments essentially commit to say, well, we'll pay you, that much money, there's a market for the expected value of future contributions to public good in this sector with these metrics, then that would create an incentive for investors to say, oh, you're going to be planting trees, and we estimate that governments are going to, give you money for that in the future, so we'll actually put capital in your project. All right, I think I've spoken, very briefly about this, but there is a lot more ramification to this idea, and I'd be delighted to get your questions and comments. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Bengio. The floor is open for your questions. As we wait for the first questions to come in, I was fascinated, Professor Bengio, by your call for responsibility at the government level and the corporation level. But I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on what we can do as individual citizens. We can, of course, improve our carbon footprint at a very small scale. But when it comes to our use of AI, of social media, of the kinds of wisdoms that you work on, how can we behave more responsibly in our very private and family life?
Well, the collective change towards building a better society is going to come because enough people understand issues that need to be changed. That's the most important way that we can help, by being part of the movement of understanding and being part of the democratic debate, because eventually it's going to have to come from governments, and not just nationally but internationally as well. Some of these issues like climate change are international. So of course we should also do our share as individuals, but I think putting the responsibility of these changes on individuals is the wrong strategy. Individuals as citizens who can have an influence on governments because public opinion matters to governments. That is the strongest way that we can create change. So I think the education part, like understanding those problems, and getting to know better what they mean for society, and getting out of the sort of cynicism that I read a lot in our society. So I meet a lot of young people who want to do something good, but they have the impression that the system cannot change. This is how things are. How could it be different? But in reality, history shows that we've been through many changes already, and it's not static. We keep improving, and sometimes we also have some steps backward. But we can provoke change by being part of it and having hope in the future.
Thank you. On a une autre question pour vous. Est-il possible de penser à un marché qui supporterait des enjeux d'égalité raciale ou d'égalité entre hommes et femmes?
C'est une bonne question. Un sujet sur lequel j'ai pas suffisamment eu le temps de parler, c'est comment on mesure des contributions au bien public, comme par exemple l'équité, comme par exemple le fait de réduire les discriminations, etc. Donc, je pense qu'il y a des réponses à ces questions, mais on n'aura jamais... Donc, il y a des métriques, il y a des gens qui passent leur temps à réfléchir à ça et qui ont des propositions. Je ne suis pas nécessairement l'expert là-dessus, mais déjà, on a des problèmes gouvernementaux qui essayent de nous forcer à mesurer des choses. Et le fait de forcer un peu les acteurs dans la société à optimiser ces métriques-là, c'est un pas dans la bonne direction. Mais il faut comprendre que les métriques ne sont jamais parfaites. C'est des proxys pour ce qui nous intéresse vraiment, qui est difficile à mesurer, mais c'est correct. C'est dans la nature des biens publics qu'ils ils sont pas toujours faciles à mesurer. L'important, c'est que les gouvernements envoient le message que ces biens publics sont importants, qu'il y a des métriques qui pourraient changer dans le futur et qui sont simplement le mieux qu'on est capable de faire aujourd'hui pour pousser les gens dans le bon sens. Et c'est comme ça que je pense qu'on pourra avoir un impact plus grand sur le comportement des sociétés. Il y a une autre manière dont on peut avoir un impact, c'est en changeant la manière dont les sociétés, je veux dire les compagnies sont organisées. Il y a une structure de pouvoir dans les compagnies qui fait en sorte que c'est le poids des investisseurs en premier qui guide la manière dont les choses sont faites. Il y a une hiérarchie de pouvoir qui fait en sorte que même si un individu dans la compagnie voudrait agir pour le bien public, pour réduire les discriminations, par exemple, mais ce n'est pas nécessairement facile parce que ça va un petit peu contre l'intérêt de la compagnie. Donc, comment est-ce qu'on change les règles du jeu pour, par exemple, donner plus de pouvoir aux employés dans les compagnies, sur le board, par exemple, comme on fait en Allemagne? Je pense que comment est-ce qu'on fait en sorte que les gens soient moins... qu'ils aient plus de sécurité financière, parce que s'ils perdent leur emploi, ils ne sont pas complètement à la rue, et donc soient plus prêts à défendre leurs valeurs face à une requête qui vient de la maximisation du profit. Je pense qu'il y a plein d'outils comme ça auxquels on doit travailler pour que l'instinct moral naturel qui existe chez la plupart des êtres humains prenne plus de place dans les décisions.
We have another question from the audience. How much does fake news affect what we know about AI? Very curious to hear your thoughts on this.
I don't think it paints potentially a partial picture of what AI is about. So I don't know if there are fake news about AI. AI can be used to create fake news, like create false pictures, for example. AI can also be used to detect fake news. So there's a lot of research in that direction, but it's hard. It's not something that we will fix in the next few years nearly as well as humans can, because we don't have machines that can actually understand natural language. It may look like it, but they don't actually.
Thank you. Je pense peut-être la presque dernière question de l'audience avant ma dernière question. Comment la société civile pourrait-elle utiliser l'intelligence artificielle pour contribuer à faire changer l'opinion publique?
Ben, on a un projet. Je pense que la réponse, c'est d'abord, c'est pas avec l'intelligence artificielle qu'on va faire changer l'opinion publique, mais il y a des situations où on peut utiliser l'intelligence artificielle. En fait, donc, on a un projet à Mila, dans mon institut, où on utilise l'intelligence artificielle pour illustrer visuellement les conséquences des changements climatiques. Donc, on va, d'ici quelques mois, mettre ça sur un site web. Vous allez sur ce site, vous tapez votre adresse, comme dans Google Maps, et vous allez voir votre maison, mais on va vous montrer votre maison telle qu'elle est aujourd'hui et telle qu'elle pourrait être s'il y avait des inondations, par exemple, pour vous faire comprendre ce que ça peut être d'avoir sa maison inondée, ou si on va aussi peut-être vous la montrer avec le ciel rouge, comme on a vu en Californie, avec les feux, etc., pour essayer, et puis on va vous donner des informations sur les changements climatiques, pour que les gens aient une compréhension, pas seulement factuelle de ce qu'on est en train de faire comme dégâts à la planète, mais quelque chose de plus personnalisé qui les touche. Donc là, on utilise l'intelligence artificielle pour synthétiser des images qui aident à passer un message.
Merci énormément. Another fascinating question from the audience about the green consumer. Could we know the price of a good, but also its carbon price? So, for example, in Ontario, restaurants must disclose the calorie count of every item on the menu. Why not the carbon emission of every item on the menu? What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. So I think a necessary component of the story I told you this evening is greatly increased transparency in what is going on behind the scenes right now in how products are made, in the way that companies operate, and in particular to be able to track these kinds of questions, to be able to measure what matters for public goods like carbon. And so the awareness, the ability for the public to know, like if we knew how products were made, maybe that it was, exploiting labor in some poor country, or it emitted a lot of carbon that was not necessary, or it destroyed biodiversity in some place. If we knew these things as consumers, I think it would have an impact. But if we can measure these things, we can also penalize companies to make sure they don't do these things. So the measurement and the monitoring and the transparency are all like super important tools that we are not using sufficiently to achieve those social goals.
A bit of a provocative question. If the logic of markets and capital are a root cause of inequity, why would this change anything beyond treating a symptom and not the root?
Alignment between the incentive to just maximize profit and the incentive to improve public good. Okay, so we have these two vectors that are not well aligned. This is really bad when it's like this. Okay, and so what I'm saying is, I think we can change society so that markets, companies, and so on optimize public good rather than profit. And it's not going to happen in one day, but we can go. We're already moving in that direction. Like a lot of the things that governments are doing is trying to steer companies towards acting better for society. I'm just saying, we need to maybe go at the root of changing even how markets work by changing the incentive system and creating these additional incentives that push companies towards better. But in the case of the example of carbon that I gave, it's going to take enough transparency in the operations of the company so that we can measure that thing that we're trying to monitor and either reward or penalize.
Thank you. And the last question, and hopefully this will end us on a positive, optimistic note. I'd like you to imagine your life in 2030 and tell us what AI is doing for us 10 years from now.
Well, I'm there are many places where AI could really help the public good. Currently, I'm co-chairing an international committee, the Global Partnership on AI, where we're trying to think about these questions. And there are potential applications to really help with issues in climate change, biodiversity, education, health. One example that I'm involved in is drug discovery. Right now, there's a market failure that's endangering all of us because no company is working on antibiotics. And within 20 years, we might be in a situation where there could be 10 million deaths per year if we don't do anything. And there's a potential for AI to be used to discover these drugs. And companies are not going to do it. It's going to have to come from somehow either philanthropy or governments, but at the international level, it's going to be governments at the large scale. We don't have the right kind of economic infrastructure for organizing these large-scale deployment like we did in the 60s with space exploration, to really exploit AI to get rid of hunger, get rid of these medical problems that I think are fixable, or at least do our best to, with the tools, with the science we have, to attack some of these sustainable development goals that currently our markets and our governments are not addressing. And I think it's possible, but it's going to take political leadership. That's it all comes back to this.
Thank you so much, Professor Bengio. Merci énormément pour la présentation and for the fascinating discussion.